Hey everybody, it's Baron Von Spee here, back with you for another video for Christian Clash, and I'm back with my good friend Pastor Brad. Pastor, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, praise God. I am as well. Hey, we do a lot of prayer requests here at Christian Clash, and I have been remiss in posting this in the chat group on the Line Chat app, but I would just ask if people would pray for my parents. They are dealing with the flu right now, as I know many people have been dealing with the flu, and it's devastating them health-wise right now, especially being older. It's more difficult for seniors who deal with that. So just pray for my parents and just appreciate that. So thank you very much. Well, hey, we are going to be answering some questions. We asked members of the Line Chat app. For those of you who don't have it, you need to get it because it's a great way to fellowship and connect with others. But we've asked our members to just post some different questions that Pastor Brad and I can answer on biblical topics, and we're going to attempt to do that today. We've got some very weighty topics that people have asked about, but we're going to try and tackle those and do the best we can to provide you some answers. So as you can see on the screen, we've got a few questions that have come in about the rapture. We're going to put that on hold for just a minute and come back and tackle those in just a moment, but we want to get through some other questions first that might be a little quicker to answer, and then come back to that very, very complex topic and talk about pre-trib and post-trib and all of those fun and exciting discussions that people have. Well, the first thing we have, Pastor Brad, is somebody posted something, and we put this poll up on Monday, and I have a feeling it has to do with that because the stock market has been plunging. Dow Jones went down. It's come back, for those of you who watch that sort of thing, it's come back midweek here doing a little bit better, but boy, it was down early, and I guess people are concerned about their finances, and some people say things like that are the end of the world and pointing to crashes and markets, falling and what happens. Any response to people's concerns about that?
Well, I know how it's been presented, the sky is falling, kind of ideas. I guess I would say that when we had a big fallout in the 80s and in 2008, we lost 25%, I think, especially in the 80s. I know there was like a 25% of the stock market value went away. And that number is a smaller number, but it represented 25% at that time. 1,100 to 1,600 today is 4%, on some of those swings, on the closing swings of a day. And so we're losing a lot less, even though it's the greatest number ever lost. I guess it's a smaller percent of the total pot, and so I guess it's not as gloom and doom, but who knows? People want to talk about things and make things scary, and so they can pick all kinds of numbers.
That's right. Well, at the end of the day, God is in control, and from just a pure secular financial standpoint, I would just remind people that the stock market has crashed many times before. You referenced a couple. Obviously, the biggest one in the 1920s was a major crash that started a decade-long depression economically, and I would just remind people, first off, from a spiritual standpoint, God is in control, so let's not worry about that. From a monetary standpoint, it's interesting to note that some of the biggest gains in the stock market always happen after the biggest crashes. Go back to the 1980s or more recent ones. You talk about Black Monday or Black Friday being two examples. What a lot of people forget is the next day and the next week, the markets went back up quite a bit, and so just keep your faith. If you look at the stock market from a long-term perspective, if I had a graph to show you, it would be going from the bottom left to the top right over history. And so the stock market is a long-term deal. So definitely you can't make decisions based on what happens in a couple of day or a couple of week or even a couple of month period. It's a long-term deal. So have faith. Think long-term in your investments. And now we're a financial show. Who knew?
Yes, put your faith in things above and store away things that will last forever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so if you need any financial help from a Christian standpoint, check out Dave Ramsey. I've taken his courses and strongly believe in the principles he applies to your everyday finances. So definitely check him out. Well, let's see what's next here. We have a question. When Jesus died on the cross, did a part of God die? And if yes, how can we understand Jesus' death in relation to God? I don't quite understand the question. Pastor Brad, do you? And do you have any wisdom to impart on that one?
I'd throw out, what do you consider dying? To die does not mean to go out of existence. death is separation from this mortal body. As Christians, we believe that those who've gone before us aren't, non-existing anymore. Physical death is where the spirit soul separates from the physical body. And so in that sense, yes, God died because Jesus was God in human form, and his soul separated from his body. John 19:30 says that. However, if by death we mean a cessation of existence, then no, God did not die. For God to die in that sense would mean that he ceased to exist, and neither the Father nor the Son nor the Spirit will ever cease to exist.
Exactly. And we have to remember Jesus conquered death and hell during that time. And so death from a physical or limiting standpoint, like you said, is very different from an eternal, endless standpoint. And so obviously God didn't die from that sense in the way that we think of it. So it's one of these concepts where I think it's tough to wrap your brain around it. Like time, for example, the idea of God having always existed and always will be existing, that's a difficult thing to think of as, we always think of a beginning and an end, and with God there is no beginning and end. He's always been and always will be. And so one of those tough things to perhaps understand. We have a question here, more of a statement. Revelation, explained in detail. Pastor Brad and I had a good laugh before we began the show here today. Entire books and sermon series and, an encyclopedia and lengthy websites and all sorts of resources exist to discuss Revelation and attempt to explain it. I've taken Bible studies with pastors that I know and trust, and honestly, I still feel as if I have only a very surface or a cursory understanding of that very complex book. Sum it up for us. Give us, Pastor Brad, the Cliff Notes version of what's going on in the book of Revelation. I know a tough order to ask from you, but attempt to do that.
I'm going to have to go with the idea that if you can't read the book of Revelation and see it as hope, then you've got to go back and look again. There is hope in the book. It goes through all the horrible stuff, and we spend a lot of time talking about what those horrible things mean sometimes, or trying to say, well, this means this country, or this means this time.
What are those lampstands all about?
Yeah, there's some really big posters that have been carried into some really big churches and put on the stage, but I'm not sure that should be the focus. And we're going to get to that too when we get talking about the rapture and stuff too, but it's got to be a hopefulness that Christ rules, Christ, is going to judge, and he's going to bring righteousness and that kind of thing. We've got to remember those pieces of that book. And I would recommend a book by a pastor named Scotty Smith, and the book is entitled Unveiled Hope. And if you want to listen to music about it, I know it's old school, but Michael Card has a whole album that ties into that book. And so Unveiled Hope, you can search it, Google it, whatever, look it up, and it'll give you an idea of trying to take the sensationalism out of Revelation and focus on how can we find hope.
Absolutely. I think that's a great message. It is a book about hope, and we know that in the end, Christ reigns. So that's, I think, Amen. The biggest takeaway. So Revelation, wow, we summed that up in 2 minutes. How about that? That might be a first. Very good. All right. Best pieces of evidence to support Christianity when talking to non-believers in hopes of showing them the way. I've got an idea, but what do you think?
I know that people want to debate things, but you've got to pray and you've got to let the Holy Spirit do his work, and people will come talk to you and want to know about Christ. So it's not about winning arguments. It's about sharing the gospel, the good news. And I mean, it's nice to have some resources to be able to discuss things, not to have arguments, but discuss things. And so you can go to, a book like Josh McDowell and find some stuff that he's got on some quick answers. There's a little book called The Compact Guide to the Christian Faith, I think. That's another one that just got some very quick answers. I think someone in one of our line chats brought up Hank Handegraff, the Bible Answer Man. He's got some good stuff out there. But so there are quick question and answer things, and you can Google a lot of things. There's a website called gotquestions.org. That's an amazing site also.
This is really funny, actually, because I was going to give pretty much the exact same answer you did. GodQuestions.org is a great website. Josh McDowell, his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, definitely look that up, because when anybody comes to you with questions, especially these gotcha questions of, oh, the Bible says this, or, ooh, I took this verse out of context, and so the Bible all of a sudden somehow endorses slavery, or whatever they think might be the case. Josh McDowell's book has some great responses to that. GotQuestions.org, another excellent website. So perfect answer, exactly what I was going to say. Let's look at the next question here. How does someone get over living like the prodigal son? This is a question that I think we sort of tackled in our previous video about forgiving yourself. There are a lot of Christians, Pastor Brad, who have trouble forgiving themselves. And, everybody has a different story of salvation. Some people have grown up in the church, and so in a sense, they've kind of always known Jesus, and it's just been a maturation process of connecting the dots and really understanding, okay, from, I heard these stories as a little kid, and now that I'm older, I understand them, I appreciate them, and I'm applying those words to my life and living as a Christian who's accepted Christ. And that's obviously very different from the Christian who has come to faith later in life. I have a very good friend of mine who doesn't do any gaming at all, but he is a later in life Christian. And that's been an issue for him, is he has things that he's dealt with, sin, things that he's done wrong, or living in a lifestyle that's not condoned by Christianity or the Bible. And so he has a tough time reconciling that lifestyle with his current lifestyle as a Christian and wanting to live a pure life dedicated to God that honors family and is truthful and whatnot. So talk to somebody who's maybe struggling with that past lifestyle and having a really difficult time reconciling that with their newfound faith.
Well, we use the term a prodigal son, and we can go back and find that in the Bible. I would look at the prodigal son. If you're still in that place where you're away from God, one day the prodigal son looked around and said, I don't have to live like this anymore, and he went home. So for you, those of you who are still caught up in stuff, someday you're going to realize, and I hope it's today, that you don't have to live like that anymore, and you can just go back to God. For those who are traveling and getting stuck and not sure what they're thinking, God is waiting for you. He's excited. Like the father in the story, God ran back to this son as soon as he saw him coming back to him, which is, there's so many things you could say about that, but God is excitedly, expectantly waiting for you to be there. And once you've arrived, you don't have to think about the stuff. The Father didn't say, why did you go there? He didn't bring up all the stuff from the past. He killed the animal. He had a great feast, and he said, this is my son. He was dead, and now he's alive. That's what God focused on in that story, and that's what God focuses on in our real lives.
Absolutely. We've talked about this on our previous broadcast, but in a sense, we are all prodigal sons and daughters. Romans is very clear. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's everybody. That's not, those people who didn't grow up in the church, they're the only sinners who need Jesus. Every single human being, whether you grew up as a Christian in the church with, Christian parents, or you grew up with parents who didn't know Christ, you weren't in the church, and you didn't come to faith until your dying day, excuse me, we all need Jesus. Jesus' death is for everyone, not just for those who think that they have an understanding of Christianity. So there's a positive feeling that's there in that Jesus' hope is for everyone, and it's not just for a limited group or a few people who may have their life together or seemingly have their life together. So hopefully that's inspirational and encouraging for you. Well, let's talk about probably the big elephant here, the rapture. Now, obviously, we could spend an entire video on this, and maybe with the number of questions, surely clearly there's a very interested group of people who want to talk about this. So maybe it does demand a further video or broadcast down the road, but let's at least briefly touch on it. And I guess my feeling is this, and I really want to hear what you've got to say. I think we get too caught up in this debate about the rapture and how it's all going to take place. I'm reminded of the verse where Jesus talks about coming back like a thief in the night, which essentially means we have no idea when or how or if it's going to happen. Now, mind you, there are plenty of verses in the New Testament that talk about how Christ will return, his ascension, that talk about how he left and how he's coming back. And so you can point to a number of verses. There's certainly biblical information that's there. But I think at the end of the day, we need to remember that we don't know how or when this is going to happen. And so let's not get too caught up in it. We also have to be reminded about the fact that here we are in 2018. There are people who were living just immediately after Christ's death and original ascension into heaven who thought he was coming back right then in their lifetime. And here we are 2,000 years later, approximately, with Christians who are still wondering when Jesus is coming back. So if we talk about what may happen in our lifetimes with this tribulation and are we ever going to have to face that, we very well could be, there could be Christians 2,000 years from now who are debating the same question of, wow, here's Pastor Brad and Barron talking about, when Christ is coming back and how that's going to look. Isn't that interesting? Because here we are in year 3,000 or 4,000 still wondering the same thing. So we don't know that answer. And for a lot of people, the thief in the night has already happened. There are billions of people who are dead now, who were Christians or not Christians, and their thief in the night moment, if you will, has already taken place. So they've already had that opportunity to either accept the forgiveness that Christ offers in his death and resurrection, or to reject that. So, and for many of us, that may be the same thing. We may be dead before Christ ever returns. So that thief in the night moment, we don't know when that's going to happen for anybody. So I guess my setup is, regardless of whether you are pre-trib or post-trib or whatever you want to describe yourself as, I think that's less of a concern than, is somebody saved? Does somebody know Jesus Christ as their personal Savior? I'm more concerned about that than the hows and whys. So there's my 2 cents. Pastor Brad, I'd love to hear what you've got to say.
I completely agree with you. Jesus gave us a command to go into the world and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them. And I want to teach them the good news. And those are the things I want to do. If you have questions about what's being said, talked about, you said there are Bible verses, 1 Thessalonians in chapter 4, 1 Corinthians in chapter 15, that talk about being caught up in the air. That's probably the closest tie to what we call rapture. The term comes from a Latin word, but it means caught up. We won't sleep, but we'll be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. That's the Corinthians verse. I don't want to get too caught up in talking about, are we going to be here for certain tribulations and stuff, because Jesus was pretty clear that we are going to be facing tribulations. I don't know if that's the Great Tribulation or not, but he said be ready for it, because it's going to come. You will suffer tribulation. You will suffer these things. And so based on some of those kind of things, I don't get too much into pre-post, mid. There are some mid believers of tribulation kind of things. It's important to emphasize, for whether the tribulation is for all Christians to endure for the whole time or not, really doesn't matter to me, because I know that following Christ, there will be tribulation. I've got to be ready to face it. I don't know if that's going to entail all the things that are found in the book of Revelation or not, but I don't count on a great snatching out so that I can be saved from tribulation. I count on going through it with Christ as my Lord and God and Savior, and him being there with me no matter what happens.
Absolutely. I think that's a good response. And, as far as tribulations are concerned, we can talk about the tribulations that are to come, going back into Revelation and looking at some very horrible things that will take place before it's all said and done. But we also have to be reminded that tribulations take place now. There are Christians who are facing massive, massive trials literally today, and have been throughout centuries, all around the world. There are Christians in places like China where it's forbidden to have a Bible. It's forbidden to go to church. People are in gulags today because they are house pastors who had the audacity to share the word of Christ to people in that nation. There are Christians who have been slaughtered in other nations. There are Christians who have been set on fire or crucified and killed in all sorts of horrible ways in places like the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, where Christianity is certainly not a majority as it is here in the United States. So when we talk about Christians facing trials and tribulations, that takes place today. We have a persecuted church today that around the world, they are not free in the same way that we are to even have this broadcast, to even have a YouTube video talking about these issues. There's no way they would have the ability to do that. You go to North Korea, for example. That's a great place where Christianity certainly is not flourishing in that country, and it certainly wouldn't be tolerated there. So as we think about tribulations that are to come, let's also be reminded about the tribulations that are taking place now.
Right, and just because I'm not having a hard tribulation like some people are around the world, doesn't mean God favors me, and it doesn't mean that God's not favoring them.
That's true.
Jesus promised that there is martyrdom ahead, that there's judgment ahead, that there's tribulation ahead, and that he will give us his Spirit to get through it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I don't want to flake out on the people who are maybe expecting a definitive answer. So if you have to say, if you are pre, mid, or post tribulation, where would you come down? And I definitely will give my answer as well. I won't flake out either.
I think my denominational background is pre-trib, but I probably would fall on post.
And why would that be? Give me your 30-second. If you have to put yourself in one category and pigeonhole yourself, why would that be?
Jesus tells his disciples in Matthew 24 that they will deliver you up to tribulation. You'll be put to death, and many will fall away. Most men's love will grow cold. This gospel of the kingdom. Jesus in 16:33, the world you have before you will give you tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. I think he's preparing me for tribulation, and I don't know that it's not the Great Tribulation, but even Matthew 24 says that there will be a great tribulation such as not been seen from the beginning of the world and ever will be. And he's not talking about us not seeing that. So that's for me. That's probably where I land.
You know, I struggle with the concept because I can see biblical evidence for each one of the three major positions. I suppose at the end of the day, I would say that I'm pre-trib, and I would base that on 1 Thessalonians 1:10. Believers are told to, quote, wait for the Son from heaven. I've always felt that was meant for believers to be waiting for Jesus' return, not for the Great Tribulation to come. So I've kind of rested my hope on that, but I can certainly see biblical evidence for each of the positions. But if I had to say, all right, if I have to give an answer, then I would say I'm pre-trib. But, you know, I don't say that. I'm certainly willing to say that that's completely and totally wrong from a biblical accuracy position. I could be absolutely wrong on that. But just my hopeful nature, my own personality, I'm kind of a cup is half full kind of guy. I'm hopeful that Jesus will spare us from that great tribulation to come. But certainly we could be seeing that. And honestly, with just the persecution the church faces even today, which is terrible in nature, we could be in the middle of a tribulation right now and perhaps not even realize the extent of it. So I'm certainly willing to say that there's biblical evidence for each position that could make it absolutely accurate. So that's where I would come down if I have to pick one. So there you go. There's my answer to that as well. Well, any other thoughts on some of these questions on tribulation, revelation, or anything else we've covered today before we close up shop?
I think I've about stuck my foot in my mouth enough as I need to.
Sounds good. I think we both put our actual beliefs out there, and so that's good. So everybody can bash us in the comments below if you want to. But hopefully we've started some good discussion and good conversation. Hopefully we've given you some things to chew on. We may come back to this topic later on, this tribulation and rapture topic later on, and do a broadcast. But we hope we've answered some questions for you. Anytime we do these videos, if you have other questions about the content that we've discussed, feel free to put comments there. We will definitely respond. We can also respond in the Line Chat app. If you'd like to post further questions, we would love to get your answers out there and get you some good help and resources. So for Pastor Brad and Christian Clash, I'm Baron Von Spee. Thanks for watching. Click that subscribe button. Thanks for being with us today, and may the Lord bless you and keep you. Take care.